Warm greetings, Code Monkeys and fellow VEDSies, and welcome back to CodedLockFilms. Today I am going to be completing one of the two challenges most recently set down by my friend Matt, which is to condense an entire genre of some kind down into 5 definitive examples. And I have chosen the fantasy genre, because I am a big fan of fantasy, I've experienced quite a lot of it, and it's something that I really enjoy talking about. With that, let us begin with item number 1 on the list, The Lord of the Rings. I know, kind of obvious, but of course I'm gonna put this on the list. I mean, come on, really. And I may be cheating here, but yes, I am including the movie adaptations in with the overall category of Lord of the Rings. And though it is not depicted here in this little pile, I am in fact including both the Silmarillion and the Ralph Bakshi version of the Lord of the Rings, as well as the other 2 Hobbit movies, but I only have the first one because it's the only one that I really enjoyed. When it comes to the original texts, the reason for including them is, I would think, fairly self-evident. Tolkien, through The Lord of the Rings, basically invented the fantasy genre as we know it today. Without The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion, the fantasy genre would look nothing like it currently does. Everything from the fact that elves have bows and commune very closely with nature, to the fact that dwarves all have really cool, complicated-looking beards and dig in mines, like everything, all of that stuff basically comes directly from The Lord of the Rings. When it comes to the Ralph Bakshi version of The Lord of the Rings, the reason I include that one on the list is basically because of its value as a historical piece. The thing about fantasy movies is that most of them are just kind of not good. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, but that's really another video entirely. And the Ralph Bakshi version is actually a really good example of the types of fantasy movies that fantasy nerds had to settle with for a really long time. It is very thoroughly a product of its time and is very demonstrative of just how fantasy operated in the movie world for many years. And then of course we have Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, which not only changed the ways that fantasy movies are made, but really changed a lot of things about how movies are made in general. These movies normalized the idea of a movie lasting longer than 2 hours. They, along with the original Star Wars trilogy, kind of helped cement the idea of the trilogy as the gold standard in Hollywood. They changed the way that movies are marketed. They changed the type of movies that get made and greenlit. And when it comes to the Peter Jackson Hobbit trilogy, well, they are sort of a really good example, a really good microcosm of all of the negative things that have developed as a result of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. And they're also a very good demonstration of the general principle that just because something works for one particular fantasy story doesn't mean it's going to work for another, even if there's stories in the same series. But regardless, that overall is entry number 1, and I actually have to change the battery on my camera because it's about to die. The second thing on my list is Dungeons & Dragons Edition 3.5. Fantasy role-playing is a really big deal to me. And it's an even bigger deal to fantasy nerds of a generation just above me. Because again, we have to remember that until Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, we didn't really get good fantasy movies. And if you wanted to experience a good fantasy story outside of the medium of novels, you were pretty much shit out of luck. And then along comes Gary Gygax's opus, Dungeons & Dragons, which created a fantastic vehicle for people like me to create our own fantasy stories and act out characters in a world that would unfold and develop as we took part in it. The reason I say Dungeons & Dragons Edition 3.5 is because I feel that it's sort of the best microcosm of how fantasy RPGs function, generally speaking. But if one had the time, I really would say that it's worth looking at every individual iteration of Dungeons & Dragons, all the way up through their most current edition, dating all the way back to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Because looking at all of them really does give a great overview of how this type of game has developed and changed over the years. The reason I say that 3.5 is kind of a definitive version is because it very much sits in the middle of 2 extremes. One extreme being a very loose set of combat-related rules and a whole bunch of role-playing stuff, and the other extreme basically being tabletop wargaming, but with a little bit of role-playing thrown in here and there. Dungeons & Dragons has been sliding back and forth on that spectrum for a very long time, and this is, I think, the most definitive version of Dungeons & Dragons for that reason. Number 3 on my list, The War of the Spider Queen Sextilogy. This is a series written by 6 different authors. Their names were, Richard Lee Byers, Thomas M. Reed, Richard Baker, Lisa Smedman, Philip Athens, and Paul S. Kemp. And the development of the series was overseen by a guy named R.A. Salvatore, who is undoubtedly most well known for creating the character of Drizzt Do'Urden. This series actually takes place in a Dungeons & Dragons setting called Forgotten Realms, and those of you who are familiar with this setting and with R.A. Salvatore's work are probably wondering why it is that I'm not using the Legend of Drizzt as my definitive example. Well, there's a couple of reasons for that, but basically what it boils down to is that I think that this series really exemplifies the idea of the anthology novel. This is something that is fairly common in the fantasy genre and also somewhat common in the sci-fi genre as well, where there will be a big overall setting and you'll have a number of writers who have special permission to write stories and create characters within that setting. A lot of fantasy game settings will do this to help kind of better establish what their internal world is all about. So because this series is written by 6 separate authors and overseen by one author that is really well known within this particular world, I thought it was a better example of the general principle than just the works of one guy. This series, I think, is also a really good example of 2 very specific things. One, how do you write a story in which the characters involved are very, very powerful? And B, how do you write fantasy bad guys? One of the things that tends to hold fantasy series back is that oftentimes they will skimp on the villains a little bit. The villains tend to be a little less interesting than the rest of the story that surrounds them, oftentimes justified by them being corrupted by some pure essence of evil or something like that. This series does not do that. It focuses on 6 characters, all of which are thoroughly evil people to one degree or another, but they are all very, very different kinds of evil. Also, there's the fact that drow have become something of an iconic fantasy race. Drow is this particular setting's word for dark elves, and if you really want to get a good idea of what drow are all about as a race of fantasy beings, this is pretty much the best way to go about learning about what these guys are really like as villains, and what makes a villain in general interesting. Number 4 on the list, just give me a second here. Okay, this stack's a little heavy. The Dresden Files series. Yeah, as you can see, this one's pretty extensive, and actually there's another one of the books that I don't currently have on the stack because it's downstairs. So I'm gonna put that down. Alright, there we go. Whew. The Dresden Files is, to me, the best and most definitive example of the urban fantasy subgenre. Basically the idea of taking traditional fantasy elements and transplanting them into a modern setting. These sorts of fantasy stories have been getting more and more popular in recent years, in particular giving birth to the paranormal romance subgenre. The Dresden Files in particular is sort of a paranormal mystery series. It's about this guy named Harry Dresden who is a private eye and also a wizard. Not only is this series really, really great on its own, but it's also a really good example of how to deal with the issue of power creep. Power creep is a term that we use in the fantasy genre to describe the issue of how do I put this? Basically, as characters in a story become more and more powerful as a series goes on, it can be more and more difficult to write compelling stories about those characters, A, because the more powerful they become, the less relatable they can sometimes end up being, and B, as they become more and more powerful, it becomes much more difficult to provide them with adequate adversity, without the whole thing becoming kind of cartoonish. But that is the Dresden Files series. It's actually my favorite fantasy series of all time. But now we will move on to the 5th and final thing on this list, which is the Harry Potter series. Except for the Cursed Child, because just nah. I actually don't hear Harry Potter being brought up very often when it comes to the fantasy genre, but it really is a very definitive example of modern fantasy. It blends both elements of classic fantasy and urban fantasy together in a really interesting way. It's both a classic hero's journey and a coming-of-age story, and is just really damn good on its own terms to boot. But it really does have a very important place in the history of the fantasy genre. Not only did it get an entirely new generation of young people interested in fantasy stories, but it really revitalized the culture of reading in general. I was growing up at the same time that this series was being made, and a lot of my fellow classmates just weren't all that interested in books and reading at the time. But then Harry Potter came along, and suddenly there were tons of people in my classes who loved to read just for the sake of doing it. And it also spawned a series of movie adaptations that have themselves been a big influence on how movies get made. They have had a profound effect on the world that has continued to this day, and very likely will continue for many, many, many years down the line. And those are the 5 definitive examples that make up my personal microcosm of the fantasy genre. Please tell me in the comments what you guys thought of this video. I'm really, really interested to see what you have to say. And until next time, Code Monkeys and fellow VEDSies, I will see you tomorrow. The second example on my list, Dungeons & Dragons Edition